Hello everyone. My name is Salil. I'm the co-founder of Adscape. Welcome to another episode of Impressions and Chai, Adscape's podcast series. Our guest today is Professor Alexa Fox. Alexa is an associate professor of marketing at the University of Akron. Alexa's research interests include digital marketing, user-generated content, online privacy, physiological measurement of cognition and emotion. But one of her research topics that I'm particularly interested in as a parent is sharenting. Um, for this, she has been featured on PBS, Washington Post, and Forbes, to name a few. Honestly, I can go on about her accomplishments, but I really want to say, Alexa, it is an honor to have you today on our podcast. Welcome to Impressions and Chai. And where does this podcast find you today?
Thank you for inviting me. I'm happy to be here, coming from Akron, Ohio area, and I'm glad to be a part of the podcast and have the opportunity.
Likewise, likewise. No, the pleasure is all ours. All right, so let's just dive into it. So, uh, I'm a parent, and I'm active on social media, both for personal reasons as well as professionals. We're an advertising technology company, obviously. I learned about the concept of sharenting only after we spoke a few weeks ago. For the sake of our listeners, could you define or explain what that means and why should parents take it seriously in today's day and age?
Absolutely. Sharenting is simply using social media to share information, including photos and videos and any other text type of information about one's child. Typically, we think of this behavior occurring from a parent or guardian being the one who's doing the sharing on social media. It can also come from a variety of other stakeholders, other adults who would be sharing about a child. And we can talk about that perhaps as we get further into it. But really, as far as parents go, like I said, that's typically who we think of when it comes to sharenting. And really, many of today's parents grew up sharing their own lives online and on social media in many cases. So it's reaching out to similar others when they have questions or concerns or when they want to share information about their child and their experiences is natural to them in many ways. And now, as parents themselves, they're posting these photos and videos and other personal information about their children. I think it's in some ways a very natural extension of a behavior that they're very familiar with.
Okay, perfect. And why should they particularly start paying attention to it today? What are some of the things that they should be? Why is it in general something to be concerned about or to be aware of, if you will?
Well, I think while parenting may seem like the new normal, kids are all over social media, parents post them all the time. I think it's important that parents step back to really think about the impact or the potential privacy consequences of posting about their child online, especially when it comes to personally identifiable information about their children. So, when that information can somehow be linked to create some sort of an online identity about their child, those types of experiences may not necessarily seem like anything as the content is getting posted. But in many cases, especially as things compound and over time, we might start to see some different outcomes as a result of parenting. And of course, we can continue to talk about those today as well.
Okay, perfect. That's helpful. Now, parenting in general can be a demanding job in itself. I can personally speak to it, especially for first time parents or new parents. Now, in addition to navigating their role as parents, they now have to be aware of this new element of parenting. So, um, as a new parent, my next question is, what are the top three aspects that parents should think about or keep in mind, if you will, or to look for when they're sharing their kids' content on social media?
You're right, especially with first time parents, this can be a big challenge. And I also experienced that stage myself. It was a few years ago, And it is a lot to take on. And there's so many different aspects of parenthood that you learn about as you go. And I think digital presence and social media is included. So, some points that new parents or just parents generally might want to keep in mind is to consider their child's digital footprint. Once someone makes information available online, that information or traces of it may always be available. And it's really difficult to say that it could be completely removed. Screenshots and other forms of gathering that data in places that people don't realize could always be apparent. And that can be a really tricky situation to navigate. So just because you no longer see that information appear on your newsfeed doesn't mean it's no longer accessible, both by users, as I mentioned, through something like a screenshot, and potentially developers of the platform that you posted the content on originally. And then I think related to that, then the parents should really consider the future. So, would you want this information available about your child when he or she is more able to really have an opinion about it? When they're a teenager, when they're a young adult, there's different stages of life where that child is probably going to have a different perspective. And of course, as time goes on, the internet will change and social media will change as well. So just keeping in mind not just the young child, but what the future might look like as that child grows. Another point I would consider as a new parent is that, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, personally identifiable information can include a lot of different information types. Most commonly, it's really being shared as photos and increasingly videos as well, because people have more video recording capabilities and platforms can handle them more and more increasingly as well. But thinking about name and age, these are other common sharented types of pieces of information. Even thinking about indirect pieces of information that could be shared in some way. For example, even if someone doesn't share their child's location in terms of city and state directly, it could be pretty easily inferred in many cases from the parent's profile that's sharing that content. So even thinking about how different pieces of information could be linked together is another piece to think about, kind of looking at it like a big puzzle in a way. And I think the last thing I would mention too is not just thinking about your own children, but thinking about posting content that includes other children. So if there's a little play group or something that's gotten together, it's, I think, in many cases appropriate to just ask permission to make sure that all the other parents are okay with the content that you're going to post if there's going to be other children in that content. And similarly, I think it would be appropriate that if someone has content of your own child, a photo or video that they want to post as well, if it's something that you're not comfortable with, I think it's okay to politely indicate that that would be the case, and to kind of reflect your own sharenting behavior as well. Or if there's certain restrictions you'd like to kind of put in place, that it's not available on a public profile or something along those lines. I think that people sometimes shy away from those conversations because they feel like, is anyone else really saying this kind of thing? But it's really perfectly reasonable, and it's easy to kind of say, I prefer not to have that shared, or can you please make sure that you don't share it in a way that's publicly available to anybody? And those things I think are important to consider as well.
No, I think those are all very good points. And I think if there's one key takeaway that at least I would remember from what you said, or I would keep in mind, is like it just like making a mental note of whether this particular action will it have an impact in the future, for my child or for someone else's child or some parents of someone else's child. At least if you're thinking every time you're posting your children's content, I think that itself will probably give you some kind of compass, if you will, to make a decision. So all good points. Now, um, moving on, like continuing on what you just said, like when it comes to sharing family related content on social media, it could be done by parents or depending upon how old your child or children are, they could post their own content. I think social media uh, starts at 13 probably, some social media platforms. Smartphones are pretty inevitable now. Any suggestions on how parents and or children can manage their social media actions, um, as a family or individually themselves, to avoid any potential danger? So yeah.
Yes, my colleague who I work closely with on Sharenting research, her name's Dr. Maria Hoy of the University of Tennessee. She and I published a piece in the Journal of Public Policy and Marketing, that where we really focused on mothers in this first study that we kind of participated, we engaged in, and we really wanted to know, especially from mothers who were earlier on in their parenthood experience. We asked them what rules they might have in place or what kind of privacy management practices they use to guide their social media posting. So I'm going to share just some common rules about what they typically do post and then kind of what they tend not to post, just from our research. So one is that they tend to portray their child positively as cute or funny. This is typically the way they want to make sure their child is coming off in their posts. Something that either now or in the future they want their child to be able to see that content and like it themselves, so they want to sort of look at it through what they think the child might think of it now, and like I said, years from now, maybe if the child's too young to know what it would be like now, or just thinking about what it would be like as they're an older child. And then another common topic of what people tend to post is milestones. So birthdays, or if there's holiday gatherings or family reunions or something that happens and you want to make sure you document it for kind of memory purposes. And then activities done as a family as well, something that is fun and you want to kind of showcase that your family is happy and enjoying their time together. Again, all kind of about that positivity perspective. As far as common rules that we heard about what people tend not to post, the first one we always heard is nudity. Anything that would be partially or, of course, completely sort of making their child, exposed in some way. The other one that's kind of related to that, but it is a little different, is something that makes a child look provocative in some way. And we heard this especially from mothers with daughters. So concerns over the child posed in a certain way or wearing a certain type of clothing that might make them look more like an adult or make them look in a way that is more not so innocent. And I think making sure that that can't be misconstrued. Something, another kind of turning away from that though, is thinking about the mother and her reputation. We also kind of heard that the mothers would never want to post something that would compromise her reputation. So something that could be taken as controversial or something where a lot of people would sort of question what type of parent she was. And then the last couple rules that we had heard was something where it could be taken as a mother not being safe. And this was most directly related to physical safety. So, again, kind of related to compromising the mother's reputation, but especially we heard it when it comes to things like safety. And then anything that would even just be considered unflattering of the child or portraying something embarrassing or even something sad in many cases. And again, I think this last one really kind of highlights some of the struggles that we've seen with social media generally. Everything is sort of portrayed positively as if there's not really any negative kind of content that's happening in your life. And of course, while those things may occur, right, the unflattering moments, the sad moments, those things are happening. Those things are not what's being documented online. And so I think that really ties into what we've even seen now in society, where people are very focused on, is this real and what's the effect of that positive content, that always positive, polished, perfect content being real, and looking at the perspective that it doesn't reflect reality. And it's hard for people to keep that in mind, I think, as they're consuming social media content. But certainly we even saw that reflected in a common rule of something that was not to be posted about their child. So those were just a few things that we heard from our mothers, and I think it does rather reflect typically, like I said, what you might see in many cases in terms of sharented content out there in the wild on social media.
No, I this is very very thoughtful. I think there's a lot to think about, right? Like the impact it can have not just your family, but maybe friends of your kids, or other families. um yeah, and I 100% agree with you in the sense that what's portrayed on social media is definitely far from reality, and that can have a slightly not a real picture, if you will, of what's going on, and people take that as ground truth, and then it's hard to sort of move forward if you're using that as a gauge for how your life is versus somebody else's, if you will. So good points there. Now, again, building on top of what he said, so far we just talked about parents and children, but in the information that you shared with me a few weeks ago, there are other stakeholders that may have a role to play in this as well. Um, you know, and there's several of them. Can you talk a little bit about how all these stakeholders can come together to make internet or social media in general a safe place for everyone, but specifically for our children?
Sure. So in that same study that I just mentioned in the Journal of Public Policy and Marketing, the second step to that, the next kind of research study that we took on was looking at how a company's social media engagement tactics might result in parent sharenting. So we were looking at the company or the brand being the one that was encouraging or sort of requesting this content. And we found that mothers, again, we kind of focused on mothers as our sample, but that they really seek to engage with companies as friends on social media. And I think this stems from my point earlier on, where parents have grown up with this concept of having a lot of connections or friends on social media. And so it's almost as if everyone you are connected with, whether they're an actual individual person or if it's more of a brand or a company, you see them as a friend. And that's how people want to connect. So increasingly, brands try to encourage this perception of understanding what it's like to be a mom, sounding like a close friend. And by doing so, they develop a relationship with a mom the same way that another individual would. And so, developing that relationship in a friendly way, so to speak, through social media marketing tactics like contests or sweepstakes or virtual chats, or everybody post a photo of your child wearing this brand of clothing or eating this snack or whatever it might be, depending on the type of brand, they might simply ask parents to share those photos or videos of their children. But in doing so, they're also triggering sharenting. And that's something that we found that was really an interesting implication of all of this is that now it's a brand that's encouraging that behavior. It's not just sort of being necessarily thought of course the parent's the one that's making the decision to do it, but it's being encouraged by a brand who seems like a friend in some cases. So I think that parents should keep in mind that while they might feel like they're just communicating with that company or whoever is maybe managing the account on behalf of that company, that in many cases these are public accounts. These are pages that are publicly available. This is a public Facebook page or Instagram account or Twitter account or whatever it might be. And this could make the information privy to anybody online, really, without any bounds. And so just making people aware and remembering that you might feel like you're having a one way conversation or kind of a conversation with just one entity, but really there's so much opportunity for that information to be unpacked and seen elsewhere and kind of to have this exposure that you might not be realizing as you're actually engaging in the behavior. And then beyond companies, I think too, I started to look at this with some colleagues where it was a variety of fields were represented by these colleagues that I worked with in a paper that was recently published in the Journal of Consumer Affairs, describing sort of a modern ecosystem of sharenting involving key stakeholders beyond just parents and children as we typically think about it. And in addition to companies, which I just mentioned previously in kind of how they can trigger sharenting, we also look at schools, extracurricular organizations. We looked at big tech companies and their role in all of it, third party data brokers, even policymakers like the Federal Trade Commission, and all the different roles that they might play in this sharenting space. So I'll just give one example from those, which is schools, because it's something that I think everybody can probably relate to pretty well. Our research in Journal of Consumer Affairs discusses how parents sometimes raise concerns that teachers are not just sharing information in a way that they expect, but maybe it's going out on a school website, which might be publicly available, or it could be on social media, either their own social media as the teacher, or as the school social media or the district's social media. And many parents don't necessarily realize the extent to which that information is going to be shared, or even the implications of that information potentially being shared. So parents, for example, might consent that that the school is able to use a learning management app that stores the child's personally identifiable information. And that could include things like photo, in addition to the basic sort of contact information about a child. They might store that information on a server, and that could potentially be considered some sort of unrecognized sharenting, even in a way, because you're not necessarily even familiar with all the different places, or even understanding all the different places that that information could be shared as a result of consenting that your child can use that app, or that a parent can, or excuse me, a teacher can share your child's information via that app. So it's really important to recognize that digital sharing increases the opportunities for unauthorized individuals to become co-owners of information, compared to maybe more of a physically limited context, which parents themselves would have grown up with, like a bulletin board in a school's hallway. This is very different as far as having your information portrayed there compared to the digital information that's being stored. And maybe you're not necessarily even sure all of the places that it's either being stored or shared further beyond what you consented to.
Yeah, no, I think there's, I guess, it's probably, to if some key takeaways from what he said was, probably one is, I think every stakeholder has to approach this in a responsible manner in terms of what they're requesting and how they're using the information that is being requested, and taking, I guess, positive cognizant steps towards making sure that that information stays protected. And then, providers of that information, like parents or kids who are signing up for these kind of scenarios, whether it's a learning app or a um, institution-wide social media app, even if it's not public, it can end up anywhere. I guess your analogy of thinking about, it's not just a bulletin board in the hallway where you can just take the pins off and it's gone. It's a lot more than that, and it will be very hard to erase, or get rid of the information that you've provided. If you start thinking about that, then I think we can make social media a much more positive experience for everybody, while making sure that private information stays private, and our kids are safer on the internet. So, very, very useful information there. Now, that really brings me to the last part of the podcast. This is something that we do with every guest that we have here. I have three rapid fire questions for you, which I typically ask. Are you ready?
Yes.
So first is, can you name one or two best books that have had a major influence on you, on your life in general, professionally or personally?
So I'll try to maybe approach it a little differently, one personal and one kind of professional book. I try to walk in faith as I navigate the joys and challenges in my life. So the Bible has had a major influence on my life throughout my life, but now I'm actually experiencing similar versions of the stories that I knew as a child with my own children. And I recognize how I continue to learn from the messages as I develop personally and professionally in my life. So that's been kind of an interesting experience for me to see how it changes my perspectives and my approach to learning about it, but always being able to kind of receive new information and also trying to share that with my children. And then I would say, related to Sharenting, I'm going to kind of offer a book related to Sharenting that has had an impact on me. I really appreciate, there's a book called Growing Up Shared by Stacy Steinberg, who is a colleague and friend of mine. And this is a book that is really geared toward anyone who's raising children in the social media age. Stacy is a legal scholar and professor and a practicing attorney, and she has done a really nice job of kind of considering it from a variety of angles, including some of those legal angles. And she recognizes that although people grew up in an environment where social media was familiar, we're the first parents to be kind of traversing this uncertain territory and what it means. So it offers a lot of practical advice in terms of protecting children's digital footprints in our increasingly connected world in a way that I think many people could relate to and understand. And she draws on a lot of evidence to really support her points as well.
So, growing up shared by Stacy Steinberg. I'm going to make a
Yes.
note of that. Probably make it available in the podcast notes as well, for people who want to consider it. Um, and then this might be a slightly, I don't know, a different question. But what is your favorite social media platform?
That's kind of a tough question because I teach social media marketing. And so I use social media often and I try to stay relevant on all the platforms that I can. But despite teaching it, researching it, and enjoying using it myself, I'm also a skeptic of social media in a lot of ways. Maybe it's because I also study privacy. So I think just in general, like anything, moderation is best. And when there's too much reliance on or kind of focus on social media, just like anything, it can get to be a bit of a problem. And so that's the challenge I think I would come at it with in terms of social media because there's a lot of maybe benefits and some not so great features probably of all the different platforms out there. But that said, I think Twitter has always been of particular interest to me because there's really nothing as seamless as a retweet. Every platform has the ability to sort of share content, but it doesn't happen as easily or maybe appear in one's newsfeed as seamlessly as it does on Twitter. And I think that that is maybe its most unique feature. And I've always kind of appreciated just how quickly that content can be shared and consumed. And there's just a lot out there. So that's probably the one that I would have to say is my favorite if I chose one.
Perfect. No, that totally makes sense. Um, Now, your work is, I think, a lot of people, especially parents, are going to find your work very, very useful. So, if our listeners have to read about your work or connect with you, what is the best way to connect with you?
Sure. I have a website, alexa-fox.com, where you can learn more about my work and how it's been featured in some of the news publications and the media that it's been in as well. And it's summarized there. And you can also find different ways to connect with me, including if you'd like to email me or anything along those lines. But since I love Twitter, you can also find me on Twitter. My username is Alexa, KAYE3. So I'd be happy to connect there as
Okay.
well.
Alexa KEYE. We will make all of this information available in the podcast episode. Well, Alexa, this was extremely thoughtful, very informative, and I think a need of the hour for today's parents at least. I think I'm going to walk away with some useful tips and suggestions that I will start thinking about seriously, as I use social media. So thank you once again, for being on our podcast, and wish you the best with your research and work. So,
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure.
right, thanks.